Good evening from the land of Israel with Hashem's loving grace. Baruch Hashem. Welcome to part 2 of our Story of Passover series. These Amuna hour lessons, we've devoted 3 lessons to give us a deeper understanding and appreciation of the Passover holiday. Because according to Halacha, we're start learning about a holiday a month before. And on Amuna hour, we want to get everyone to fulfill this obligation. So we're learning this together. Now, the more the story of Passover becomes alive in our hearts, the more meaningful our observance and celebration of the holiday, especially the Seder night. And we were to share this with the family, and especially with the children and grandchildren. I want to preface, we left off last week. If you didn't see last week, which was part 1 of the Story of Passover series, that was slavery in Egypt. Yeah, you can go on laserbeams.com or on amunabeams.com. It's already posted. You can see that. Okay, so we left off last week with our introduction to Moses, the circumstances of Moses' birth and his childhood in the palace as Pharaoh's stepson, and his subsequent escape from Egypt after he killed the Egyptian slave driver. After wandering for many years in the desert, the Midrash tells us that Moses became king of Ethiopia for 40 years. Moses was a mighty warrior, and Ethiopia was suppressed, and Moses won there. He became general of the Ethiopian army because he was throwing through it. And then he was such a brave warrior and such a fantastic leader that they made him king of Egypt. But then they gave him the queen of Egypt, but she was an idolater. So Moses never consummated the marriage. And because he wouldn't do it, he eventually had to flee Ethiopia because of the idolatry. But Moses was 40 years all over Africa, and he became king of Ethiopia, what the Midrash tells us. So from there, he arrives in Midian. Okay, for a little geography, little biblical geography, Midian is in the northern Red Sea area, and it includes northwestern Saudi Arabia, the northern part of the Red Sea, and the eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula that borders on the Red Sea. So today's, the southern port of Jordan, which is Aqaba, and the southern Israeli port was Eilat. Aqaba and Eilat are exactly the very northernmost parts of Midian. And then it goes down along the Red Sea area, both sides of the Red Sea, the Sinai side and the Saudi Arabian side. And this was where Jethro lived, Jethro in Hebrew, Yitro. And Jethro became Moses' father-in-law because Moses married Jethro's daughter-in-law, Tzipporah. Now, Jethro, he also fled Egypt. Jethro was one of the 3 advisors to Pharaoh. When the first was the wicked Bilam, who he spots up, we'll see him later through Torah, throughout the year, the wicked Bilam. Wicked Bilam, he's the one that advised Pharaoh, if you don't have one problem with the Jews, then you have to enslave them. Okay, so the Midrash tells us that the wicked Bilam, he gave bad advice. He ended up dying by the sword. The second advisor was Job. Job was quiet. And because Job was quiet, he didn't protest. And Job had to see the book of Job, the type of tribulations that Job had to get himself cleaned up. The third advisor was Jethro. Jethro didn't agree to condone the evil, and so he ran away. He ran away from Egypt. And that way Jethro, since he ran away from evil, then Hashem, and measure for measure, let him get close to good. And he was the biggest idolater. He was the biggest professor in the world for comparative religion. He knew more about every type of idolatry than any person on earth. And because he left all that idolatry and went to monotheism, he succeeded to be Moses' father-in-law, and his daughter Tzipporah married Moses. Okay, so when Jethro left Egypt and he became a monotheist in Midian, Jethro was ostracized by all the neighbors, all the shepherds, because they were all idolaters. Everyone in Midian, like in Egypt, they were idolaters. And it was the fact that Jethro didn't have sons at the time. He only had daughters, and his daughters were chased away. They wouldn't let their daughters get access to the well. They had all kind of difficulty. And Moses comes on the scene, and Moses single-handedly chases all these people that are tormenting Jethro's daughters, and he waters the sheep. You come in and you see that Jethro asked his daughters, who did this favor for you? They said, this Egyptian nobleman, who was a Hebrew, bring him home. Okay, invite him home for dinner. So invite him home for dinner. And then Jethro had in his backyard, he had a staff. This was called staff made of sandpinon, the hardest rock in the world, harder than diamond. And this was the staff that it went way back to but to Adam. This was staff that belonged to Adam. Okay, and it had Hashem's name carved on it. And the only person that knew the secret of Hashem's name to pull it out was planted in the ground like a tree. Nobody could pull it out. And Moses right away picked it right up to the ground. Jethro knew that Moses was a man of God, and he knew that this was Hashem's chosen messenger, and he was more than happy to take him as a son-in-law. Okay, so now Moses becomes Jethro's son-in-law. Moses is delighted to tend Jethro's flocks as a shepherd, because as a shepherd, Moses could spend all his time out in the wilderness. There's nothing to do but keep the sheep, talk to Hashem. Nobody could bother you. And this was why our forefathers, King David was a shepherd. Moses was a shepherd. Abraham, Isaac, and David were shepherds, and Jacob were shepherds. Our forefathers loved tending flocks because it took them out in the wilderness, and they could spend their time just sojourning with Hashem, talking with Hashem. And this is what most love to do. King David, this is notes, if someone really loves speaking to Hashem, they say, Rabbi Nachman says that's a sign that that person is a descendant of King David, because in King David's offspring, he gets this from his DNA, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But King David, he loves speaking to Hashem. King David's great-grandson, Judah. And Judah also tended flocks, they had sheep, and that because they could spend their time talking to Hashem, right? So Moses is spending the time, and Moses takes it back into the wilderness. Moses comes to southwest Midian, and southwest Midian takes you to a mountain called Mount Horv. Mount Horv is the same as if some people say that it's the same as Mount Sinai, and there's another opinion that says it's in the Mount Sinai chain, but it's a different mountain, okay, whichever it is. But it takes right away to Mount Sinai, the big group of mountains that are Mount Sinai. Okay, and Moses goes there. This is exactly 1 year, what is the future going to be Passover night. Now, the setting, when Moses gets to Horv, to Mount Horv, Mount Sinai, the children of Israel are in excruciating slavery. We left off last week, and it's getting worse by the day, worse by the day. Pharaoh makes conditions worse by the day, and they're screaming out. At this point, they're screaming out to Hashem. So Hashem, of course, hears the screams. There's no death. There's two things. There's no T-Pex. Nothing is erased in Shemayim. Hashem hears every prayer. Hashem hears everything. And so it's like this time Hashem engineers in his precision, divine direction that Moses will come to the burning bush. Moses sees the burning bush, and he's amazed by it. So Moses comes close, and Moses warned, don't come any closer. Don't come closer. Take your shoes off. You're at a holy place. And the burning bush is not only consumed, this is called a rotem bush. It's a desert burning bush, a burning desert shrub. And it should be consumed in a second. Now he's not consumed, but Moses hears the voice of God within the bush. Okay. So Hashem says, I have a mission for you. Now, once again, the children of Israel at this time have been slaves for 115 years, out of which the last 80 years have been the most terrible. Moses is either 79 or 80 at the time. Ever since Moses was born, the slavery became worse and worse and worse. Okay, so Hashem tells Moses that he hears the cries of the children of Israel in distress, and he wants to deliver them from the hands of the Egyptian oppressors and bring them back into the promised land, the land of Israel that he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, and so Hashem wants Moses. Hashem wants you. Okay, you are selected, Moses. You're going to bring my people out of Egypt. Well, as mighty as Moses was, and as brilliant as he was, Moses was so phenomenally humble. One of the reasons he was so humble, because you say if a person is small and weak and not so humble, what's the big deal? Okay, but if a person is mighty and he's brilliant, and on top of that, he's humble, this is why the Torah will tell us later that Moses is the most humble individual that ever walked the face of the earth. Okay, so Moses, he refuses Hashem. He says, I can't be your emissary to take the children out of Israel. Who am I? Who am I? In Yiddish, it's I'm nothing. So, and Moses argued that the children of Israel wouldn't recognize his authority to speak as a leader. They could say, all kinds of arguments. He says, Hashem, they'd say, oh, you grew up you didn't grow up in the hot sun like we did. You grew up in the palace and you can't understand us. And he said another thing, Hashem, that how are they going to think that I'm not tripping out on LSD or something like that? When I say I revealed Hashem, Hashem wants me to send. He says, they're going to ask me for proof. Want your name. So Hashem told Moses to identify him to the children of Israel as the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who will come to redeem them from slavery and take them to land, the promise. And there's two words in Hebrew, podo yifteh. He says that's to recognize that the elders, they'll know because this is the same language that Joseph used. And if it weren't the same language Joseph used, then they know something is not right here. But as soon as you use the same language that Joseph used, that Hashem will redeem them, then they'll know. So Moses still doesn't accept. Moses debated with Hashem for an entire week. Imagine arguing with Hashem for an entire week. And Moses had all kinds of arguments. And this week was the exact 7 days of Passover, what in another year will be the 7 days of Passover that started on the 15th day of Nisan and then the 21st, including the 21st day of Nisan, which is the 7th day of Passover. By the way, it's after sundown here in Israel now, and we've just started the new month of Nisan, which is the first month of the year. And this is one of the 4 Hebrew New Years today. It's a Hebrew New Year for kings, and everyone gets their new appointments on their, any position of authority is given out from Shemayim on this day. So a good Chodesh, happy new moon to everyone. Okay, so this was when Moses was debating, the week that Moses was debating with Hashem, this was Passover week. Okay, Moses, he had two really strong arguments. He says, listen, Hashem, I'm a fugitive from Egypt. I'm wanted there for murder. They've still got a warrant for me for the Egyptian slave master I killed. And second, he says, Hashem, how can you send me? I stuttered. Moses stuttered. And Moses said that this is what they call, the Torah says, a heavy tongue. And the story of Moses stuttering is that when Moses was a little boy, the soothsayers of Pharaoh said, Hashem, that's a Hebrew child. He's going to overthrow you. He's going to overthrow you. He says, no, he's loyal to me. He loves me. He's my daughter's adopted child. Can't take away Batya's adopted child. So they made a test for him. And they put a plate of gold and a plate of hot coals. They put this in front of Moses. Moses was a little tyke, maybe 3 years old. And Pharaoh put Moses on his lap. And he says, if he chooses the gold, the soothsayer says, if he chooses the gold, which 99 out of 100% he's going to do, like and shall the glittering gold, then that means he's going to throw you. And if he picks the hot coals, that means that he's loyal to you. Well, of course, Moses, like any other little toddler, wanted to go for the gold, but Hashem sent the angel Gabriel, and the angel moved Moses' hand to the coals. Not only did he pick up a coal, but he put it on his tongue, and this burned his tongue really badly. And ever since that, Moses stuttered. That's how Moses stuttered. So Moses argued with Hashem, how can I be a diplomat, and how can I speak to Pharaoh in Pharaoh's court when I can't even put two words together? So Hashem countered both arguments. First, the argument that Moses is a wanted fugitive, wanted for murder. Hashem said that the people that want you, the people that have any power against you, they're not there anymore. They're not there anymore. And there's no more there's no more warrant on your head. And even if there's a warrant, nobody's got any power against you because I'm with you. And second, you don't have to talk. You could speak Lashon HaKodesh, you could speak Hebrew, and I will send Aaron, your older brother, and Aaron will be your speaker. He will be your spokesman. Okay? So Moses, Hashem countered. You can't win an argument against Hashem. And Moses, after 7 days, Moses has to, he does. So now Moses and Aaron, they go and they confront Pharaoh. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 years old when they entered the palace of King Pharaoh. Now, this is not simple. There's an entire description in the Midrash of what went on. The Torah goes through really quickly, but the Midrash goes in great detail what happened. Okay, undaunted, they walk past successive security and guard stations as if they own the place. And nobody could get into the palace because we'll soon see Pharaoh had an interest that nobody should get in to see him. because Pharaoh was a little midget. He was embarrassed of his side. Pharaoh was about 3 feet tall, 3.5 feet tall. That's all. And Moses was a giant. Pharaoh was intimidated by Moses. Moses was 8 times the size of Pharaoh. Okay. So they walked past a paralyzed company of guards. The guards, they're paralyzed. They can't move. They're like stones. And the guards, out of witchcraft, the soothsayers of Egypt had a pack of wild lions surrounding the palace. And the wild lions, they were also, some of them were paralyzed. The other ones, they saw Moses and Aaron, they were like purring like kitty cats, like little cats, like tabby cats, like Eric's tabby cat, or David's tango. Yeah, they both, David and Eric have both tabby cats. Okay. So this was a place where no invited visitor could enter. And nobody had ever been in, no stranger had ever seen the king of Egypt in person or spoken to him, except for his astrologers, his soothsayers, his counselors. So Pharaoh had to hide himself for public eye. Why did Pharaoh have to hide himself for public eye? Pharaoh had propaganda full of Egypt that he was a deity, and he and the Nile were the co-gods of Egypt. The Nile was a god, and Pharaoh was a god. Okay, so a god doesn't need to use a bathroom, but Pharaoh was not a god, and he did periodically had to use a bathroom. And it's one thing with the Torah. The Torah is humorous. The Torah says every time where Moses and Aaron confronted Pharaoh, they caught him on the Nile, and they caught him early in the morning where nobody was up yet, and Pharaoh was going to the Nile to relieve himself, and they saw him right there. The Torah has a description of Moses and Aaron several times, literally catching Pharaoh with his trousers down. He's catching him with they're right there. Don't say that Hashem doesn't have a sense of humor, okay? Because Hashem makes humor of idolatry. And Pharaoh had to hide himself in public eye because you can't let people see him go to the bathroom. And he didn't want to know that he had to relieve himself like a human. He certainly didn't want to know that he was this little midget. So after he was afraid that he might get found out, that they made a law that all midgets were sub-deities or something like that. They were like in the British court, you're knighted. They have this series of royalty. Okay, but a knight, an earl, a vicar, whatever they are. Okay, that this is he's an earl of godness. They're special people. They were godly people, and Pharaoh was the head of them. All right, so they made this whole garbage ideology about but still he didn't want people to see him. So all of a sudden, right in Pharaoh's holy of holies, unquote, Moses and Aaron come marching in. Where the guards, and he's frightened and he's astonished. And Pharaoh was shaking by their sudden appearance. So he asked the two brothers, "What do you want?" And they sounded like a command. All they say to him, they look him in the face, and they say, "Thus spoke the God of Israel, let my people go." That's Aaron says, the name of Moses, look him right in the face. And that's it. And he said it like a Marine drill sergeant, but he didn't bark it. He said it quietly. So Pharaoh, of course, hardly refused. And he says, "Oh, he never heard of Hashem. I never heard of Hashem before," he says. And he says he never heard of the God of the Israelites. And his name is not registered. Pharaoh had a register of all the gods in the world. It's like if you have a business, you're registered in the IRS or you're registered in the thing. In Israel, you have to be a registered businessman. Hashem wasn't a registered deity. He wasn't in Pharaoh's register. Didn't appear. And so Pharaoh accused Moses and Aaron of creating a conspiracy against the government and interfering with the work of the slaves. And that was a fine excuse for him to make the work even harder on the slaves. So in retaliation of the surprise visit, that same day, Pharaoh ordered supervisors to increase the demands of the children of Israel and to make their burden even heavier than it was until now. And it was really heavy. Okay, so as we explained last week, first they were supplied with raw materials, and then they took the straw away, then they took the clay away, and they had to do everything and still have to keep the same quota. And we didn't make the quota, and every day they didn't make the quota, they killed their children. Well, the children of Israel were physically unable to cope with the impossible task of fulfilling Pharaoh's quota, even now more than before. And they were in desperation. And they saw Moses and Aaron coming again to Pharaoh. They went every day for a month. And they shouted at Moses there, they reproached Moses and Aaron. They said, what are you doing? You're ruining our name. You're making life even worse for us. This is a test of Amuna. We can see this, a classic test of Amuna. We hear this all the time. We can see that every year, what the Haggadah says, that we all leave Egypt, we all leave our personal freedom. We see so many times that each one of us has a test of Amuna, and we strengthen ourselves in Hashem. Just when we strengthen ourselves in Amuna, life seems harder and seems things may be worse. Don't worry. This is from Hashem, and it's a test because it's like a person going through basic training, and now to get your wings or your next stripes, now you're going to go through a big test. And the biggest test is in combat. Okay, so now Moses and Aaron are deeply disappointed because they don't want to see their brothers suffering more than they've already been suffering. So they cry out to Hashem. Hashem consoles them and says, no, don't worry. Don't hold the stopwatch. Very soon, you're going to see that your mission has been accomplished. And not only the children of Israel, Hashem says, will see my glory, all of the world will see it. Okay, and that's it. This took 3 months. 3 months after the first visit. We're now 9 months before Pesach. So let's see that the 3 months said Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. This is like around the 1st of Tammuz in the year before the exodus of Egypt. Now starts the plagues. Now starts the action. Okay, so now we're going to learn the 10 plagues. And with each plague, I want to make an emphasis on the Hashgacha Pratis, the divine direction of each plague. They weren't happenstance. Each plague had a measure for measure back to the Egyptians. Okay, so when Moses relayed the message, Hashem's message of let my people go to Pharaoh, the Egyptian monarch is snarled back in chutzpah. He says, who is Hashem that I should listen to him? And besides, I've never heard of Hashem before. You can see this in the Torah, this 5th chapter of Shemot, 5th chapter of Exodus, 2nd verse. And this is unprecedented chutzpah to talk to Hashem like that. And Pharaoh was begging for punishment. Hashem punish. He was begging Hashem for punishment, and he's going to get it. Now, unfortunately, and you see this today, you see this in Israel, you see this today in America, you see this in the UK, you see this with the liberal. Unfortunately, many Jews were influenced by Pharaoh's attitude. Rashi says specifically, when the Jews are having a hard time, they identify with their oppressors. They think that life is going to be easier when they identify with oppressors. Okay, we're going to be British, and then there won't be anti-Semitism in Europe. The exact opposite. It's what the German Jew says. Oh, we'll be Jews at home, we'll be Germans on the outside. They thought that would solve the problem. No way. The Americans say, oh, no, we're not American Jews. We're Jewish Americans. You think you're Americans first? Okay. They come along, this group and this white supremacy. And any time where we think we've got it too cushy outside, even in Israel, people think the government of Israel, this is not the kingdom of David. Okay, we are just as much in Israel, and if this is not politically correct to say this in Israel, but it's the truth. We are just as much in Golus, just as much in diaspora in the land of Israel as our brothers are in the UK and in Australia and the USA. The difference is that our feet are on the holiness of the land of Israel. We have the holiness of the land of Israel. The difference is that I make trumas and maishas out of fruits and vegetables. The difference is observe Shemitah. But as far as the government, the same government that goes against Torah and tramples Torah and makes gay parades in downtown Jerusalem, with shot of the wall. This is diaspora. I don't think the British government wouldn't allow that. They wouldn't allow a gay parade in front of a synagogue, but the Israeli government allow it. And provocations, and today it's not easy. It's not easy. So don't think, we're all in the same boat. We are all in the same boat. We all need Mashiach. We all need freedom from Egypt. Okay, freedom from Egypt, and we all need Torah, and we need the Moses of our generation, the Mashiach of our generation. We all need it, and we need to lead us out to true freedom. And the Gemara tells us that true freedom, but the Torah, true freedom is with Shabbat. True freedom is with eating kosher. True freedom is being able to learn Torah. True freedom is the observance of Torah. True freedom is Hashem's justice not the justice of some person who violates everything. But mine can't work properly. Mine can't work properly. So within so-called, anyway, we're not going to get a rant, but just want to see this happened to the Jews in Egypt. They thought that by identifying with Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they'd have life easier. But boy, did they make a big mistake. So what they did, the Jews in Egypt, 80% of the Jews, it's just like today. 80% of Jews, we say, but we read the 80%, only the Torah loyal populace, it's same in UK, the same statistic all around the world, 20% Torah loyal, the Jewish population, 20%. I don't know what way to call it, Shomer Shabbat or Orthodox or whatever you want to call it, but it's 20%, 1 out of 5. And it was the same in Egypt. This is some type of classic, inexplicable statistic that just goes, King Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun. And we see this. We take a good look at the history of the history of Egypt and our exodus from Egypt. It is the same thing right now. Okay, so Hashem sent the 10 plagues not only as a punishment for Egypt, but for the benefit of Israel. Okay, boys, wake up. Look who's leading the world. You think Pharaoh runs the world? You attribute power to Pharaoh? You think, I pledge allegiance to the Pharaoh of Egypt? No, you don't pledge allegiance, not to Pharaoh of Egypt, not the flag of Egypt. You pledge allegiance to Hashem. Okay, so the plagues were just as much for our benefit as they were for the Egyptians. Now, here's one thing we have to learn in order to understand the plagues. Hashem has 3 intrinsic lessons in each one of the 10 plagues. And these 3 lessons are lessons of Amuna. The plagues teach us Amuna. Number 1, the plagues are all designed to teach us that Hashem alone is creator of the world. There's no partners and no co-partners and no co-chairman. Hashem alone is creator of the world. Number 2, Hashem directs the world in a precision matter of divine direction down to the tiniest detail. Want more on that? We wrote a whole book called Divine Direction that describes this exact point. But the 10 plagues are all Hashem showing that he runs the world down to the tiniest detail. He is the creator and director in the language of the Rambam. And the third, we learn, Ein od milvado. The 3 words of Amuna, we wrote a whole book about that also. That there is only Hashem, nothing in Hashem. Hashem doesn't need any assistance. Nobody can stop Hashem. Nobody can hinder Hashem. People think they can spoil Hashem. Said everything that's going on is exactly what Hashem wants. There's no one but Hashem. And Hashem does what he wishes and whenever he wishes. And we'll see now by the plagues that Hashem decides when he's going to use nature and he decides when he's not going to use nature, when he's going to override nature. It's just that to Hashem, it's all the same thing. Okay, by the way, with Amuna, above nature is nature. Because when you're Amuna, you're above nature. So miracles are natural with Amuna. So we need to sharpen our Amuna to appreciate the 10 plagues. Now, Pharaoh, once again, he is the king of idolatry who fashioned himself as a deity, and he denied one by one every one of these 3 points. So the fact that he denied one by one every one of these 3 points, not only deny Hashem, if he denies Hashem, he certainly denies the 3 points, these 3 points of Amuna. Okay, now the 10 plagues is going to show us who's right, Pharaoh or Hashem. Okay, so we've got Hashem telling us that he runs the world, that he alone does and will do everything, that he creates everything. And Pharaoh says, no, there's no Hashem. No. Okay, let's see. We will now see who is right. Okay, let's test. We got 10 tests, the litmus test, who's right. Plague number 1, in Hebrew it's called Dam. That's the plague of the blood. Moses and Aaron, they walk down to the riverbank of the Nile. Aaron raises his staff. He strikes the water and converts them into streams of blood. Then all the waters of Egypt turned into blood. Pharaoh and all the people of Egypt, they all saw this miracle. They saw the fish die and the blood flowing all over the land, and it turned the Nile. The Nile was their god. Now the Nile smells disgusting from all the dead fish. It smells disgusting from the putrid blood in the hot Egyptian sunlight. It's terrible. And was it possible for them to drink from the water of the Nile? And the Nile, the waters were always famous for the delicious taste of the waters of the Nile. and they tried to dig deep in the ground for water, to only find blood. Unfortunately for the Egyptians, not only the floodwaters of the Nile, but all the waters of Egypt, wherever they were, they turned to blood. And the fish died in the rivers and lakes. And for a whole week, the Egyptians and the animals, they suffered a horrible thirst, and Pharaoh wouldn't give in. Now, you have to see, Hashem is keeping them alive. A person can't go for a week without drinking water. Okay, so Hashem is keeping them alive in order to torment them, all right? Pharaoh is so stubborn, he doesn't give in. All right, so what's the measure with the blood? The Egyptians, first of all, listen to this, they spilled the blood of so many Jewish babies into the Nile that the Nile became a river of blood in their loving memory. Okay, this is a memory of the Jewish babies. Second, that the Egyptians spilled Jewish blood like water, so their water now became blood, perfect measure for measure. This is Hashem's precision, divine direction. Third, the part of the forced labor of slavery was that Jews had to be water carriers for the Egyptians. Well, their first relief from slavery is now they don't have to carry water because there's no water carried for Egyptians. But the Jews, they had all the, in Goshen, they had all the water they wanted. But if somebody would try to bring it from the Jewish neighborhood to Egypt, it would turn in, cross the border, turn in blood. Fourth, the Egyptians, they tried to prevent Jewish women from mikvah, from ritual immersion, because that way they figured Jewish women, they're not going to have children if they don't go to mikvah. Okay, so now you don't want a Jewish woman to bathe? Now you're not going to bathe Mr. and Mrs. Egyptian, so they couldn't bathe. Fifth, and this is a biggie, Pharaoh claimed that he and the Nile were the co-gods of Egypt. And he claimed that the Nile was his and created it. Okay, Pharaoh, let's see how much control you have over the Nile. So what it did, Hashem not only slaughtered the Nile, but slaughtered Pharaoh's claim. Now this takes us up to plague number 2. Plague number 2 is the frogs. Pharaoh remained obstinate in his refusal to capitulate to Hashem. So after ignoring due warning and plain warning, the second plague came to Egypt. Aaron again stretched forth his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs swarmed forth. Why did Aaron do these 2 flogs? Because the water of Egypt did a favor for Moses when he was a little baby in the ark, and the waters of Egypt protected Moses, so Moses couldn't retaliate against waters of Egypt. So Aaron had to do it. And we learn from this that if we have to be grateful to inanimate objects that do us a favor, how much do we have to be grateful to one another for doing favor? Okay, so the frogs covered every inch of land in Egypt, and they entered the houses and the bedrooms, and wherever an Egyptian turned, whatever he touched, he found the slimy bodies of frogs, and the croaking of the frogs was deafening, and it brought the Egyptians on the brink of insanity. All they heard all day long, ribbit, 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 and the frogs in their head, frogs in their face. There was nowhere to escape the frogs, nowhere to go. And the Gemara says that the frogs were so dedicated that they plunged into the hot Egyptian ovens. So much so when the Egyptians tried to bake bread, if they took a pita out of their oven, then there'd be a baked frog in the pita. They couldn't eat it. All right. So Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we learn in the book of Daniel, these were the 3 Jewish heroes that defied the Babylonian ruler of Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't want to bow down to a statue. Even it meant being cast into a fiery furnace. And they said to Nebuchadnezzar, they said, we should not serve your God, nor bow down to the golden statue that you've erected. And they were thrown into a fiery death. They were miraculously saved. The Gemara tells us that they derived their courage from the frogs in Egypt. They said, if a frog could throw himself into a furnace for the sanctification of Hashem's name, then we as Jews, we certainly can. And so they were a role model for our tzaddikim. Well, the frog, excuse me, Pharaoh was terrified by the frogs. He asked Moses, and this time he breaks down, and he asked Moses and Aaron to pray to Hashem to remove this pestilence. And he promised he'd liberate the Jewish people. But as soon as the frogs disappeared, so did Pharaoh's promise disappear. And that leads to the next plague. Before we go to the next plague, let's see what the measure for measure was with the plague of the frogs. Okay, the Egyptians forced the Jews to bring them all the time. They know the Jews that they can't eat these reptiles and snakes. They're tmeim, they're ritually impure. They forced the Jews to gather them frogs and snakes and reptiles, and to find they knew that this caused the Jews deep revulsion, because just touching them, it made them ritually impure. So, okay, you love frogs so much, now you can have all you want. Hashem gave them all they wanted. And the Egyptians robbed the Israelite slaves of their sleep. They made them work in the middle of the night. And the croaking of the frogs robbed the Egyptians of their sleep. What's more, the Egyptians threw screaming babies into the Nile. Measure for measure, zillions of screaming frogs emerged from the Nile. Okay, you want screaming? Okay, you'll get screaming. And the Egyptians tried everything to prevent the Jews from multiplying. So the Egyptians didn't have easy, because if an Egyptian tried to get near his wife in the bedroom, there would be 5,000 frogs between him and his wife. There's no way he could get near. Okay, so you prevent the Jews from multiplying. Okay, the frog's going to prevent you from multiplying. It's all measure for measure. We now go to the third plague, which is the plague of Kenim, lice. Hashem ordered Aaron to strike the dust with his staff. Again, gratefulness. We learn gratitude, even gratitude to an animate object, because the dust did Moses a favor. The dust of Egypt hid the dead taskmaster, that Moses gave him one shot to the solar plexus, and that was it, and gave Moses a chance to get away. Okay, so because the dust of Egypt once helped Moses, Moses could not strike it, and again, Aaron had to do it. So as soon as Aaron hit the dust with the staff, lice swarmed forth from the dust and blanketed the entire land. Pharaoh and the animals, they suffered untold misery with this terrible plague. Now, Pharaoh's aides, they point out, first time they said, okay, Pharaoh, you better be careful. This is the hand, this is the finger of God. How do they know? Because with their idolatry and their witchcraft, they could control any creation bigger than a lentil. But the lice is smaller than a lentil. So they had no control over the lice. And no matter what they did, their witchcraft didn't have any power over the lice. And the lice especially tormented Pharaoh's idolatrous priests, and they weren't fair. The priests wanted to give in at this, and Pharaoh wouldn't listen to him. He remained relentless in his determination not to surrender to the children of Israel and release them from bondage. So what's the measure for measure here? The Egyptians did everything to expose the Jews to lice. They wouldn't let them bathe. They made them work in the dust. They had these filthy conditions. Okay, Hashem gave it back to them. You want lice? You want the Jews to have lice? You'll get it right back. Boomerang, measure for measure. Second, that the Egyptians prevented the Jews from doing Hashem's mitzvot, and the lice prevented the Egyptians from fulfilling their daily tasks. They were so busy itching, and they couldn't do anything. This took away their concentration, took away their focus, anything. For a whole week, they're focused on life. Now, the fourth plague we're now coming to, this was a nasty plague. This is the plague of Horv, the wild animals. So the next plague to torment the Egyptians, it consisted of these hordes of wild animals roving all over the country, destroying everything in their path. You know, something crazy they did. In Egypt, they found a lot of skeletons of these big dinosaurs and whatnot. I think it could very well be part of the Horv. Okay, they went through, they destroyed the land of Egypt, they terrorized the people. Only in the province of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, just there were no plagues and no wild animals. And once again, Pharaoh screamed out, he was scared stiff. He promised Moses and Aaron he'd let the Hebrews go out in the desert on the condition that they wouldn't go too far. Well, Moses prayed to Hashem, and the wild animals disappeared. But as soon as they had gone, Pharaoh withdrew his promise, and once again, and refused Moses' demand. Now, the difference between plague number 4 is this came directly from Hashem. Moses or Aaron didn't have to raise their staff or strike the ground or everything. This came right from Hashem. Was no intervention on Moses' part or on Aaron's part. And not only included wild animals, but it was these killer birds. They're coming down, these killer eagles, and snakes and scorpions and wasps and mosquitoes. A rov in Hebrew means a big mixture, a big mishmash. And it was a mishmash of all these terrible critters. So what's the measure for measure? The Egyptians treated the Israelites with the cruelty of fierce animals. Okay, you want to act like fierce animals? Get it right back at you. So they got it right back. And the Egyptians hunted Israelite babies. Well, the Horv, the wild animals, they hunted the Egyptians. Third, that the Egyptian slave drivers intruded into the homes of the Israelites like fierce wolves at night. fierce killer animals did the same thing to the Egyptian. They walked right in the door, didn't ask come in. Imagine in the middle of the night, these are lions, tigers, wolves coming into your bedroom. Not so pleasant. The fourth measure for measure is that the Egyptians enveloped the Israelites in fear and cruelty. That it was all day long fear and cruelty. And here, the Horv, the wild animals, the wild beasts did the same thing to the Egyptians, and there was nowhere to escape. Our plague number 5 is called Dever. It's a killer cattle disease. It varied by the symptoms sound just like anthrax. Some biblical interpreters say this is like the rinderpest, but anthrax, it's a killer cattle disease, the killer bacteria. Well, the wild animals disappeared, and Pharaoh was relieved for 3 weeks. He had 3 weeks of rest, and he thought everything is fine. Okay, no more power, and then he won. He held out. He won the war. Okay, Moses warned him. This time your animals are going to be afflicted. Moses told him that start with your animals, and if you don't give it, it's going to be you soon. So many of these animals, such as cattle and sheep, they were considered deities in Egypt. Egypt wouldn't eat lamb because a lamb was a deity. This month, that's one of the reasons that the Exodus from Egypt is in the month of Nisan. That the month of Nisan is the sign is Taleh in Hebrew. That's the lamb in English. I forgot the Roman name for the month of Nisan, in the zodiac. But in Hebrew, it's Taleh, it's the lamb. And this was the god of Egypt. And during the time where the god of Egypt is strongest, this is the time when Hashem took them out of Egypt. So with Pharaoh's continued refusal, Hashem sent a fatal pestilence that killed most of the domestic animals of Egypt. This pestilence, like I said, sounds like anthrax, but the Egyptians witnessed the death of their gods. The cattle, like the Hindus that had the cattle, they too, the Egyptians, they worshiped the cattle, they worshiped the sheep, but even more. Egypt, their most prized possession and their most prized export is their horses. Arabian horses that come from Egypt. And over here in the Middle East, and we don't call them Arabians, we call them Egyptians because they call from Egypt. Egyptian horses, and they're very, very special. And their horses got killed. This was like, imagine that you have a Rolls Royce and a Lamborghini parked in your front garage, and your Rolls Royce and your Lamborghini, they just blow up. Okay, Egypt to his horses, this was his Rolls Royce, his Lamborghini, and they were just dying like flies. And the animals of Israel emerged unscathed, and Hashem shows his mind-boggling divine precision, divine direction, to the extent that the killer bacteria were given the ability. Hashem instilled in them bacteria. Look at them, one-cell bacteria. Killer bacteria, okay, Mr. Bacteria, you have to know this is an Egyptian animal, and this is a Jewish animal. Okay, it's mind-boggling that you could have, bacteria is so contagious with bacterial disease, the cough or a sneeze, and how contagious it is. Even more so than a virus, bacteria is more contagious than a virus. And here they are. Egyptian animals, they're dying right next door. Hebrew animal, no, it's fine, it's healthy. And didn't matter. Pharaoh still hardened his heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. So what's the measure for measure here with the Dever, the cattle disease? That the Egyptians forced the Israelites to tend their flocks. And Hashem freed, this was another way that Hashem freed, okay, you don't have to schlep water for them, you don't have to tend their flocks, because they don't have any flocks. They're all dead. All the sheep are dead. The cattle are dead. Don't have to tend, nothing to tend. So they took away another measure for measure. The Egyptians took the Israelites away from their traditional vocation of shepherds, as we mentioned before. So you take that, and they turned them into slaves. So Hashem took their animals away from them, measure for measure. And the third measure for measure here is that they forced the Hebrews to work as beasts of burden. The Egyptians said, well, why should I use my ox up? Why should I strain my ox? You take 2 or 3 Hebrews and put an yoke on them and make them pull a plow. They would, at the end of the day, they'd be bloody, and this was the worst type of slavery. So Hashem killed the animals that they wanted to spare. This takes us to plague number 6. And plague number 6, it's a nasty one. It's the boils. It's called shchin. It's boils. So this plague was horrific beyond description. And Pharaoh and Egyptians, once again, Hashem gave them a false sense of security. Hashem gave them a 3-week respite between plague number 5, the killer cat, and the boils. Okay, so now, once again, Aaron and Moses, they're dead. Pharaoh, beware. Pharaoh not listening. He feels fine. He had a nice dinner and everything. He's got his servants fanning him. Everything looks hunky-dory. Okay, so once again, Aaron and Moses, they appear unscathed in Pharaoh's inner court, and nobody could stop them. And this time, anyone that sees Moses in Egypt is definitely afraid. All of Egypt has this trembling fear of Moses. Okay, so they go into court. Nobody had the power to stop them. When Pharaoh once repeatedly refused to free the Israelites, Moses and Aaron took each one in their hand a handful of black soot from the oven. And they took this black soot and they threw it up in the air, right in Pharaoh's open air court. They threw it up in the air, and a miracle happened, and the foot went up and up and up and up, almost till the heavenly throne. And there it became heated, and it descended on the entire land of Egypt, and it came down as a cloud of this terrible pox that covered 1,000,000 square miles. Egypt's about 1,000, rounded out, 1,000 miles by 1,000 miles. The sound of Egypt, 1,000 times 1,000,000. 1,000,000 square miles covered with this soot of the black dust that turned into, anytime a particle of dust touched an Egyptian body or an Egyptian animal, it turned into a boil, and they were covered with it. And this was worse than the previous plagues. Not only that, it rendered the idolatrous priests, there is a law in their idolatry, that with a skin affliction like leprosy or psoriasis, sometimes flaky skin, they can't serve. This rendered them all, this neutralized all of the Egyptian idolatrous clergy. Okay, so the Midrash tells us that there were 24 different types of boils. Now, maybe you could relieve one boil, like a certain herb or a certain oil or a certain paste, but any medication that made one boil feel better made the other 23 types feel worse. So no matter what the Egyptians did, they were just wounds all over the body from head to toe, including leprosy. Leprosy was one of the types of the boils that they suffered. And once again, the worst punishment was that their priests were neutralized. And none of them, even more, they all died with the boils. The Egyptian priests, they didn't cure it even after the plague was over. It wasn't over with the idolatrous priests. It stayed by them. So we mentioned back in the 3rd plague, they already recognized that this is the hand of Hashem. And now they couldn't even show their faces. They were so embarrassed because they, according to their law, they were ritually impure, and they couldn't show their faces with the boils in front of Moses and Aaron. And now everyone in Egypt, except Pharaoh, knows that already with the 6th plague, there's no power against Hashem. Okay, Hashem is reducing the world's mightiest superpower into futility, nothing. So what's the measure for measure here? Every day, the Israelites would come home from their dusty and back-breaking work with cracked, bleeding, and pained skin. And now all of Egypt was suffering from the same. Now you know what it feels like to be an Israelite slave at the end of the day. The Egyptian slave drivers, they whipped the Israelite slaves so badly that their skin was always inflamed, and they had these infected, bleeding wounds. Okay, Egypt had all the same. And the Egyptians, they treated the Israelites like lepers. So all of Egyptian was now full of leprosy, and even worse. Plague number 7 is the hail, Bad. So with this plague, Hashem really trumps nature, defies nature completely, and shows that the world, there is nothing but Hashem, nothing like Hashem. Moses declared to Pharaoh that a hailstorm of unprecedented fury was about to sweep the land. Okay, Pharaoh didn't budge. And these were not regular hailstones. Hashem made a deal between the ice and the fire. And to do Hashem's will, the ice and the fire came together. These are tremendous hailstones, the size of hand grenades, filled with fire inside them, fiery coals inside them, raining down on Egypt in a thunder that was deafening thunder. Okay, no living tree or animal or plant escaped the fury of the hail. Only someone that feared Hashem and stayed indoors. Stayed indoors, they were safe from the hail, because anything that was anything outdoors was destroyed completely. So the only shelter they had was their houses. So this gave, Hashem gave a chance for the Egyptians to acknowledge him, to hide in their houses, and they'd live. But the ones, the agnostics, the highbrows, the leftists, they don't want to acknowledge Hashem. Okay, don't acknowledge Hashem. And they got their due outside in the hail. Once again, the land of Goshen, blue sky, untouched. Well, this time, Pharaoh summons Moses and he confesses sins. We see in the 9th chapter of Exodus, verse 27, Pharaoh says to Hashem, he says, I have sinned this time. He says to Moses, Hashem is the righteous one, and I and my people are the guilty ones. And he says to Moses, beg Hashem to stop this thunder and hail, and I'll let you and your people go. Now, when Pharaoh, he sees the thunder and the hail, can't be. The thunder, the ice and fire together, nobody could do that. Nobody. There was no witchcraft in Egypt, no, nothing. Hashem defied everything. Okay, so Moses says, when I leave the city, I'm going to raise my hands. When I say when we leave the city, Moses could not pray in the capital city because there was too much idolatry. He had to go out in the desert where there's no idolatry because he couldn't say Hashem's name in there. And then as soon as he goes out, he raises his hands. That's the end of the hail. So the measure for measure here is the Egyptians, they threw the taskmasters. The Egyptians, it wasn't that the Israelite slaves were working hard enough. They all threw rocks at them all day long. We want to throw rocks? Ooh, did they have rocks get thrown at them? But from Hashem, rocks from the sky. There's terrible rocks, stones full of ice filled with fire. And Egyptians forced the Israelites to sleep out in the outdoors with the flocks. In order to save their flocks, the Egyptian flocks, the ones that were still alive, had to sleep indoors with the Egyptians. Okay, he forced the Israelites to sleep out in the field with their flocks, and their flocks had to sleep indoors with the Egyptians. They denied the Israelites the slightest respite in the shade of a tree. The hail left them with no more trees. No more trees in Egypt. That's it. Knock down all the trees, no more shade. Egypt without shade is not a nice place. Pharaoh said, who was Hashem that I should listen to his voice? Ooh, Hashem says, you want to listen to my voice? You'll listen to the voice of the hail all day long. That's fine. Okay, so now we move on to plague number 8, which is Alba, the locust. The next time Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh, Pharaoh appeared to be somewhat penitent. You know, Pharaoh, he's got plenty. He's like a boxer in the 8th round, and he got beat up. So he's a little bit wary now. So he says, hey, if you want to go worship an Hashem, what are your plans? What are your plans? So when they told Pharaoh that they're going to take everyone, men, women, children, without exception, he agreed that only the men should go, but the women and children have to stay in Egypt, as well as their possessions and their cattle. Well, Moses and Aaron denied this offer. No, you're not going to bargain with it. You're not going to dictate anything. Okay. So Pharaoh had to show that he's still the boss, and he ordered them to leave the palace. Okay. So Moses warned him. You're looking for it again. You ask for it again. Get some untold suffering. But Pharaoh remained adamant. And they say, Pharaoh's crazy? He's adamant. This is Hashem hardening his heart. Hashem took away Pharaoh's free choice. We said, that's not fair. Why should Hashem take away Pharaoh's free choice? Pharaoh already established in the previous plagues that he wants to do evil. Okay, Hashem says, you want to be an agent of evil? I'll let you be an agent of evil. So you will sanctify my name in the whole world. So Hashem says, he's using Pharaoh. He's using Pharaoh as the New York Times, okay, publicized all over the world, the Washington Post and the London Times and whatever, okay, to publicize Hashem's monarchy all over the world. So as soon as Moses left the palace, he raised his arms toward the heaven, and an east wind brought swarms of locusts into Egypt, covering the sun and devouring everything green that escaped the hail in the previous plagues. Never in the history of mankind had there been such a devastating plague of locusts as this one, and it brought complete ruin upon Egypt. And it's as if it had been ravaged enough by the previous catastrophes. Once more, the obstinate Pharaoh, there we go again. He summons Moses and Aaron, and he implores them to pray to Hashem and just stop this. Moses complied. Moses very patient. He complies. Okay. So Hashem sent a strong wind after Moses prayed and drove every one of the locusts into the sea. Not a single one came. Now, once relief comes, as soon as relief comes, Pharaoh's obstinacy comes right back to him and refused to free the people of Israel. Maybe we're laughing at Pharaoh. Maybe we see, wait a second. How many times has Hashem tried to show us that he runs our life? But no, we're obstinate. We want to do something else, and we don't want to listen to Hashem's word. Then we complain. We complain that our life is difficult. And this is what King Solomon says. He says, and King Solomon says in Proverbs that the folly of a person skews his ways. And then he blames Hashem. Hashem, what are you doing to me? Okay, listen, if you've got diabetes, don't eat sugar. Don't eat, that's all. Don't eat sugar. This is what Pharaoh keeps eating sugar. Now, in the case with the albeh, the locust, in forced labor, the Israelites, in addition to building the pyramids and building the cities, they had to plant, they had to cultivate, they had to harvest Egypt's crops. And this was in addition to their daily quota of bricks. It's got to harvest each. Mind-boggling, the slavery. Okay, so now there's no more crops to harvest. Hashem taken one by one. Taking any type of slavery, one by one. The Egyptians, they stole a bit in the Israelites, their farming society, and they all had a little garden where they could, their poor slave subsistence, they grew a little bit of grain for themselves, they grew a little vegetables. Even that the Egyptians stole from them. Oh, you take this little bit of vegetables and fruit that the Israelis grow for themselves, now you're going to lose all of yours. And that's the measure for measure here. One more, that the Egyptians did everything to prevent the Israelites from multiplying and wanted to rid them from the face of the earth. So the locusts multiplied beyond any limits and covered the face of the earth in Egypt. Okay, now we come to plague number 9. Plague number 9 is the plague of darkness. And think not only physical darkness, today it's spiritual darkness. I think that plague is with us right now. Spiritual darkness. And we're getting when we said in the beginning, the 20% that want to hear Hashems, and the 80% that want to be politically correct with the Gentiles, that they're in darkness, as far as in spiritual darkness. They deny Amuna, they deny the Torah. Okay, and they'd say, that it's not politically correct to observe Torah. It's have to act like the nations. They want to act like Pharaoh. Okay, whether Pharaoh speaks British English, American English, French, or Spanish, or whatever. Okay, so the plague of darkness, it looks like, this is easy as a plague. It doesn't hurt. It's not a sickness. It's not that. This is, okay, it's easy. So it's dark. All right, the lights right out. There's a electric shortage. Okay, the Egyptians, they suffered unbelievable mental and emotional torment from the darkness. Everywhere a Jew went, there was light. Okay, but for the Egyptians, there was a deep abyss of pitch black darkness that completely engulfed them, and they were paralyzed. They were immobilized. They couldn't move. The Egyptians were gripped with fear, and they remained glued to their places. Wherever they sat, wherever the darkness caught them, that's where they sat. They couldn't move. So even though there was light in Goshen, listen to this, 80% of the Jews died during the 3 days of darkness. Hashem did that so the Egyptians wouldn't see the Jews die. Okay, now we're talking about 12 million Jews, according to the smallest estimate, because 3 million left. And if they're 20%, that means 12 million died. 12 million died. It's mind-boggling. So he said, well, why Passover night? We're singing, we're happy, we're our best friend, we've got the gold and the silver on the table and dressed up like clothes. How come it's not Holocaust night? The reason is that if there is someone amongst us that denies Hashem and denies the redemption, denies the Geula that we're all waiting for, that we don't cry about them. We're happy about the ones that leave. That they could have left with the rest of us. They want to stay behind with the Egyptians. I'm going to cry because you want to stay behind with the Egyptians? No. So 80% of the Jews died in the darkness, and these were the ones that were assimilated. and the ones that denied Hashem, and the ones that denied redemption. Okay. Others thought that the ones that denied redemption, they said, oh, why leave? We're going to be slaves forever anyway. And so they denied redemption, and they denied Hashem and Hashem's power to take them out of Egypt. So they stayed and they died. Okay. Which turns out all the Jews that didn't want to leave Egypt, they died. Again, Pharaoh tried to bargain with Moses and Aaron, and he begged them to depart with their people, but to leave their flocks and possessions behind as a pledge. Moses and Aaron informed him, no way. They said, we're not going to accept nothing but complete freedom, men, women, children, cattle, possessions, you name it. Okay, we're going to take everything with us. Right. So Pharaoh became furious, and he ordered Moses and Aaron to leave and never to return. And Moses said to Pharaoh, you're talking right, bro. Okay, you're not going to see us again. He warned them that if they were to come, Pharaoh said, they'd die. Moses said, it's not going to be necessary to see them again, because Hashem's going to send one more plague over Egypt. And after that, Pharaoh's going to give his unconditional permission for everybody to get out of Egypt. So exactly at midnight, Moses continued. Moses telling him, this time, Moses gives him in detail. You know who you're messing with? You're messing with Hashem. And you know what's going to happen to you, Pharaoh? He doesn't believe it. He says it's going to come midnight. And at midnight, Hashem is going to come, and Hashem is going to kill every firstborn in Egypt. You want to play with that, Pharaoh? You want to have it set, think again and free the Jews right now? Right now? No? Okay, you know what? This is what happened to you. And Pharaoh, you're going to hear a bitter cry come out of Egypt. This is Moses and Aaron warning him. This is exactly what's going to happen to you. He had the option. And Pharaoh, he denied. No. Hashem told him what's going to happen. And we're going to see next week we pick up, there's see Pharaoh in his pajamas in the middle of the night. He's going to seek the leaders of the Hebrews, and he's going to beg them to leave Egypt without delay. So with these words, Moses and Aaron turned around, they left Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was seething with rage. He was really angry at them. And this brings us to midnight, to the Paschal sacrifice, the 10th and final plague, which is the firstborn, and the exodus of Egypt. This is all together, the Paschal sacrifice, the 10th plague. And we're leaving this for next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the last plague, the killing of the firstborn, the Paschal sacrifice, the blood on the doorpost, the exodus from Egypt, and the miracles that happened then. And that, God willing, next week will be the third and final portion of our story of the Exodus of Egypt. And we hope to see you again next week. B'ezrat Hashem.